If you've ever found yourself asking why you miss your ex after so long, you're not asking a strange question. You're asking one of the most quietly common questions there is, and most people are too embarrassed to say it out loud. Maybe it's been a year. Maybe it's been 3. Maybe it's been longer than that, and you're starting to wonder if something is wrong with you. If you're broken in some specific and permanent way that doesn't let you let go. A song comes on. You pass a street. The light hits at a certain angle on a certain afternoon. And there it is, that pull, that heaviness, that particular brand of missing that doesn't quite match anything else in the emotional vocabulary. You're not stuck. You're not weak. What's happening inside you is actually explainable. And once you understand it, you may find that it stops feeling like a flaw and starts feeling like something you can work with. To understand why this keeps happening, you need to understand what the brain actually does with a significant relationship. When you form a close bond with another person, your brain doesn't simply store that experience as a pleasant memory. It reorganizes itself around the bond. Neuroscientist Helen Fisher at Rutgers University has spent decades studying romantic attachment using brain imaging, and her findings are striking. The neural circuits that respond to romantic love include the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, which are the same regions that govern craving, motivation, and reward in response to substances. Romantic love doesn't just feel like a need. In the brain's functional architecture, it operates like one. When the relationship ends, those circuits don't receive any update. They were trained to reach toward a particular person, toward the dopamine signal that person reliably produced, and they don't simply stop reaching just because the source is gone. Here's one thing about memory that most people don't fully account for. It is not a recording. Every time you remember something, you are rebuilding it. Cognitive neuroscientist Donna Bridge at Northwestern University demonstrated in 2014 that memories are reconsolidated each time they are accessed, meaning they get subtly altered and stored in their new form. This is not a malfunction. It is how memory works. But it has a specific consequence for missing someone. The person you are missing after a long time is not, strictly speaking, the person who was there. They are a composite, assembled and reassembled in your mind over months or years, partly from stored experience and partly from your current emotional state, your current unmet needs, and the meaning you've been making of the relationship since it ended. The figure your longing reaches toward has been quietly reconstructed each time you remembered them. That does not make the missing less real, but it is worth knowing what you are actually reaching for. During a significant relationship, your brain releases dopamine in response to that person's presence, their attention, their touch, even the anticipation of seeing them. Dopamine is primarily a motivation signal, a chemical that says go toward that, do that again, that matters. Psychiatrist Lembke at Stanford University, who has studied the dopamine system extensively in the context of addiction and reward, explains that after a sustained period of elevated dopamine, the brain's baseline level drops. The nervous system, having adapted to a higher average, now experiences ordinary life as flatter, quieter, and more effortful. That dip is part of what you feel when you call it missing someone. Not all of it, not even most of it, but a real physiological layer underneath the emotional one. Over time, the baseline does recalibrate. But it takes longer than people expect, especially if the relationship was long or deeply wired into daily routine. This is not a metaphor or a poetic way of describing heartbreak. It is the nervous system running an old program on new conditions. There is a layer to this that rarely gets named, and it may be one of the most important ones. You are not only missing the other person, you are also missing who you were with them. Psychologist Arthur Aaron at Stony Brook University has spent decades researching what he calls self-expansion, the process by which close relationships genuinely enlarge a person's sense of self. When you love someone, their interests, habits, world, and ways of seeing things get folded into your own. Your identity expands to include what you shared. When the relationship ends, that expanded self doesn't immediately contract neatly back. You may feel the loss of a version of yourself that could only exist in that context. The person you felt capable of being. The future that felt like it was taking shape. the everyday texture of a shared life that gave your days a certain kind of meaning. That is a layered grief, and most of the frameworks people use for heartbreak don't fully account for it. The loss of the relationship and the loss of that version of yourself are two different things, and they deserve to be acknowledged separately. Nostalgia is not a character flaw. It is a measurable psychological state with a documented function. Psychologist Constantine Routledge, whose research on nostalgia has been published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, found that nostalgic experiences reliably activate feelings of social connectedness, warmth, and meaning. Importantly, his research found that people are most likely to reach into nostalgic memory when they are currently experiencing loneliness, disconnection, or a lack of meaning in their present lives. This is not a coincidence. Nostalgia functions as a kind of emotional coping bridge. When the present feels thin or hollow, the mind searches backward for evidence that fullness is possible, for proof that you have been loved and have loved, that your life has contained richness. If you find yourself missing your ex particularly strongly during transitions or low periods, that is likely what is happening. The longing is directional, but it may be pointing at something your present life is missing rather than at the specific person who once seemed to provide it. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, and it doesn't observe the deadlines that other people or even you yourself may have set for it. Psychiatrist George Bonanno at Columbia University has spent 3 decades studying how people actually grieve, not how they're supposed to, and his findings consistently challenge the idea that prolonged or resurging grief is a sign of dysfunction. His research shows that grief manifests in highly individual patterns, sometimes delayed by months, sometimes resurging years after a loss. The end of a significant relationship is a genuine grief event. There's a loss of a person, yes, and also a loss of shared ritual, shared language, shared routine, shared future, and a shared sense of who you were becoming. If that grief was not fully processed at the time because you got busy, because it felt too painful to sit with, because people around you signaled it was time to move on, then it doesn't disappear. It waits in the body, in the nervous system, in the specific emotional weather of certain days. And when the conditions are right, it surfaces again. Finding it here, after all this time, does not mean you failed to heal. It may simply mean you have finally created enough safety to feel what was always there. Here's one of the most useful ways to approach what the missing is actually made of. Underneath every feeling, there is a need. Not a need for the specific person necessarily, though that can be real and true, but a need for what that relationship reliably provided. Safety, being truly known by another person, having someone who would answer when you called, feeling like your life was moving somewhere that mattered, laughter that came without effort, physical warmth and closeness. Each of those is a documented human need, recognized across clinical psychology, motivational science, and decades of attachment research. When you sit with the missing long enough to ask what it is actually pointing toward, it often reveals a need that has not been met in another way yet. That is not a reflection of weakness or inability to move on. It is genuinely useful information about what you are looking for and what your life may need more of. The missing, at its core, is not a problem to be suppressed. It is a message worth reading. There's actually a quiet, beautiful game built around this exact idea. A 3D sanctuary called Inner Phoenix, but more on that in a minute. Let's keep going first. Triggers bypass the thinking mind entirely. A research team led by psychologist Silke Anders at the University of Lübeck published work in 2012 showing that emotionally significant memories are encoded with what might be called sensory tags, meaning that scents, sounds, temperatures, and textures can reactivate stored emotional memories faster than conscious thought can form. This is why a particular song can make you feel something before you've even recognized what you're feeling. It's why a street you walk together, or a specific quality of evening light, or the way a stranger laughs, can catch you completely off guard. Your nervous system was trained to associate those signals with something that mattered enormously to it, and it has not fully unlearned that. When the trigger hits, the brain isn't making an error or being irrational. It is doing exactly what a brain that bonded deeply does. The training was real. The association was real. And the system is still running it. Calendars carry more emotional weight than most people realize. Researchers, including Gary Marshall at the University of Rochester, have documented what is sometimes called the anniversary effect, a measurable pattern of increased psychological distress that tends to cluster around significant dates, often without the person being consciously aware of why they're feeling heavier on that particular week. The birthday, the season you met, the month the relationship ended, New Year's, which the nervous system may have associated with shared ritual for years, Valentine's Day, which doesn't need explanation. Your body and your nervous system learned a temporal map of that relationship, and that map doesn't simply erase when things end. When you arrive at those dates or seasons or transitions, the missing can spike suddenly, often confusingly. Knowing that this is a documented, measurable phenomenon rather than a sign of personal failure can change how you hold it when it happens. You're not regressing. You are encountering a map that was drawn a long time ago. One of the most important distinctions anyone can make when they're trying to move through something like this is the difference between rumination and processing. They can feel similar from the inside, but they lead to completely different places. Rumination is a loop. It runs through the same questions without arriving anywhere new. Why did it end the way it did? What did I do wrong? What would have happened if I had said or done something different? What are they doing now? Psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema at Yale, who spent decades studying repetitive negative thinking before her death in 2013, found consistently in her research that rumination is not cathartic. It doesn't release grief. It deepens and prolongs it. Processing is something else entirely. It's not the same question cycling in a tighter and tighter circle. It's a gradual movement through the feeling toward a changed understanding, toward something that can be carried without the same weight. The movement isn't always comfortable, but it goes somewhere. If what you're doing when you think about the relationship feels like it's taking you the same place every time, that's useful to notice. One of the most evidence-backed tools for moving grief forward rather than looping through it is expressive writing. Psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas at Austin has published studies since the 1980s showing that writing about emotional experiences in a particular way produces measurable improvements in both psychological health and physical health markers. The key distinction in his research is that what works isn't simply venting or narrating what happened. It's writing that integrates, that tries to find meaning or understanding within the experience. What did this reveal about what matters to you? What did it clarify about what you need in a relationship? What did you learn about yourself in the space of that loss? Even 15 minutes of this kind of writing, for 3 or 4 consecutive days, has been shown in multiple studies to shift the relationship between a person's memories and their emotional response to those memories in lasting ways. It doesn't erase anything, but it changes what the memory asks of you each time it surfaces. The body holds what the mind has not fully processed. This is not a poetic statement. Psychologist Peter Levine's work on somatic experiencing, along with Bessel van der Kolk's research published extensively in journals including Frontiers in Neuroscience, demonstrates that unresolved grief and loss are stored in the nervous system as incomplete cycles of activation and response. When you feel that particular ache in the chest or the heaviness that settles over you around certain memories, that is not your imagination producing symptoms. That is the nervous system holding a pattern that was activated and never fully discharged. This means that addressing the missing purely at the level of thought, by reasoning your way through it, may only go so far. The body needs its own form of completion. Practices that work at the nervous system level, slow rhythmic breathing, gentle movement, progressive relaxation, extended exhalation, can help complete those activation cycles and allow the body's internal state to settle in ways that thinking alone cannot reach. One specific approach with a particularly strong research base is slow breathing, specifically with an extended exhalation. The vagus nerve is the primary channel through which your brain and your body communicate emotional state, and it can be deliberately activated through breathing patterns. A 2017 study from researchers at the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience in Dublin showed that controlled breathing directly influences attention regulation and emotional state through the vagus nerve's connections to the brain's prefrontal and limbic regions. Extending the exhalation to roughly twice the length of the inhalation, breathing in for a count of 4 and out for a count of 8, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch that governs rest, recovery, and a sense of safety. In practice, this means that when the missing hits hard and the body goes into that particular kind of ache, you have a direct physiological lever you can reach for. It takes about 60 to 90 seconds to feel a measurable shift. That's not a long time to ask of yourself in a difficult moment. Because so much of what you're grieving is tied up in your sense of self, part of moving through this involves the slow process of refinding yourself outside of the context of that relationship. Psychologist Kenneth Gergen wrote extensively on what he called the relational self, the way our identities are always partially constructed through our relationships with specific others. This is not a weakness. It is simply how human identity develops. But it does mean that after a significant loss, there is often a period of low-grade disorientation that is hard to name. The story of who you are feels like it's missing a chapter you were counting on. The recovery from that disorientation doesn't happen through forcing a new narrative into place. It happens gradually, through re-engaging with the things, the values, the interests, and the ways of being that still feel true and yours, even if they show up quietly and tentatively at first. You don't have to rebuild all at once. You are looking for what still belongs to you when you subtract what was shared, and that process takes real time and real gentleness. Psychologist Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin has built one of the most extensive research programs in contemporary psychology around the subject of self-compassion, and what her findings show is directly relevant to this. People who respond to their own pain with the same warmth and patience they would naturally extend to a close friend, rather than with self-criticism, shame, or the demand to simply get over it, show faster recovery from grief, stronger immune function, and measurably greater emotional resilience. This is not a soft or sentimental finding. It has been replicated across populations and contexts. The inner voice that says you should be over this by now, that asks why you're still letting it affect you, that frames the missing as a sign of personal failure, that voice is not helping you heal faster. It is functionally slowing the process down. You can acknowledge what you're feeling, name it without judgment, and recognize that you are a human being moving through a real and difficult human experience. That recognition is not indulgent. It is physiologically effective. Social connection has a direct regulatory effect on the nervous system, and this is not a metaphor either. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory has become foundational in understanding how the nervous system responds to social context, describes how the brain actively reads other people, their facial expressions, tone of voice, and physical proximity as real-time safety cues. When you are grieving, your nervous system is often in a state of low-level alert, scanning for threat, bracing against the next wave of feeling. The presence of another person, even a quiet and undemanding presence, helps regulate that state. You don't need to talk about the relationship to benefit. A shared meal, a walk, someone sitting in the same room as you. These are not small gestures. They are co-regulation, which is one of the oldest mechanisms of emotional recovery the human species has. You were built for proximity. And when you are hurting, proximity is not a luxury. It is part of the repair. There is a version of missing an ex that is less about grief and more about a question that still feels open. Did it have to end the way it did? Was there something I never said or never heard? What did I need that I was never able to ask for clearly? Clinical psychologist Sue Johnson at the University of Ottawa, whose research on emotionally focused therapy is among the most well-validated in the field, points out that attachment needs don't disappear when a relationship ends. They remain. And if they went unnamed or unmet within the relationship, they often keep circling in its aftermath, looking for a place to land. Part of what allows these circling questions to finally settle is acknowledging, honestly and without blame, what you needed and what you did not receive, and also what you may have not known how to offer. That acknowledgement doesn't require another conversation with the other person. It can happen entirely inside yourself. And when it does, the question that has been looping often finds something like an answer, or at least a resting place. There's a distinction worth holding onto between a relationship that ended and one that has not been completed inside you. Not every ending is a failure, and not every ending means the connection wasn't real or wasn't good. Researcher John Gottman at the University of Washington has spent decades studying what sustains relationships and what causes them to fracture. And one of the things his work consistently shows is that most couples who separate are not people who stop loving each other. They are often people whose unaddressed emotional needs created a slow erosion that neither of them knew how to stop. Honoring what was real in a relationship does not mean pretending the ending was fine. Both things can hold true at the same time. It mattered. It ended. The love was real. The loss is real. And you are still here, which is itself a thing worth acknowledging. The ending of something real doesn't undo the fact that it was real. Recovery from heartbreak is not a single decision that, once made, holds forever. It is a process, and sometimes a long one, and it moves in ways that don't always feel like forward progress. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on post-traumatic growth, along with foundational work by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina published in journals including Psychological Inquiry, finds that significant and painful experiences, when moved through with honesty and support rather than suppressed or bypassed, often produce a measurable deepening of a person's sense of self, greater clarity about values, an expanded capacity for empathy, a more honest understanding of what they actually need in a connection. This doesn't happen automatically or for everyone. It requires the willingness to stay with what's difficult instead of rushing past it. But the research suggests that what you are moving through is not purely subtractive, not just loss and nothing else. Something is being built in the process, even when the building looks nothing like what you had planned. There may come a moment, and it often comes without announcement, when the quality of the missing shifts. It doesn't necessarily disappear, but it stops being an ache that needs constant management and becomes something quieter, something more like a knowledge you carry without being carried by it. Developmental psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern University has written extensively on what he calls the narrative self, the way humans make meaning of their lives by constructing ongoing stories about them. In his research, the most psychologically integrated people are not those who have the least pain in their history. They are people who have found a way to hold the difficult chapters as genuinely part of their story, not as evidence against them. The painful chapters are often the ones from which the most essential development emerges. You are the person who loved and lost and found a way to keep going. That is a complete and real thing. It is not a consolation prize. It is the actual shape of a life being lived honestly. If you are still carrying this and it feels heavy, please know that there is no expiration date on grief that was real. Psychologist Camille Wertman, whose longitudinal research on bereavement challenges many of the assumptions that were long taken for granted in grief counseling, found consistently that people who continue to feel lost years after a significant relationship or death are not people who are failing to heal. They are often people for whom the bond was genuinely deep. What predicts well-being over time is not the speed of recovery. It is whether you are building a relationship with the missing that is honest rather than avoidant, one that allows your life to continue expanding even as the feeling remains. The question isn't when will this stop? The more useful question is, can I carry this and still keep moving toward a life that is mine? Can I feel this and still build something? Can I hold what was lost and still want what is ahead? For most people who stay with that question honestly, the answer, over time, becomes yes. And hey, before you go, there's a 3D game called Inner Phoenix. You walk through it like a quiet temple, room by room, with spaces for what you're observing, what you're feeling, what you need, and what you might try next. It was made for exactly these moments, the ones where you're trying to understand what you're carrying and where to put it. You move through it at your own pace. No pressure, no timer, no one telling you how to feel or when to be done. It's in the description below whenever you're ready.